Hello and welcome to the art and design of sci-fi and fantasy, mystery and horror. Today I speak with Touba Ghadessi about her book on how, I guess you could say, people who look different were represented and dealt with in 16th and 17th century European courts. She focuses on dwarves, as they were called then, hirsutes, and castrati. So we talk about the how otherness and alternative appearances were dealt with back then, touch a little bit on how what that means today. We talk a little bit about fantasy art, how it's sort of influenced by these old works of art from the 16th and 17th centuries, and also we touch on Game of Thrones briefly as well, Tyrion and that sort of thing. So definitely very interesting talk in regards to art of that which is different or unusual to the human eye. And we talk about how these individuals were not that different in the way they lived and dealt with the noble courts. All right, well, thank you and enjoy. I'm speaking with Professor Touba Ghadessi, author of Portraits of Human Monsters in the Renaissance, Dwarves, Hirsutes, and Castrati as Idealized Anatomical Anomalies. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for speaking with me. It's my pleasure.
So first, tell me, how did you get into studying and writing on this subject?
It was actually quite random. It's a series of me as well. I was always interested in the history of anatomy. It's something that fascinated me, and I had attended medical school for a couple of years, and so when I went into graduate school, I sort of pursued that interest with history of art, and one of my colleagues brought this fantastic portrait to my attention, and it was a very detailed portrait of a dwarf. It was really akin to an anatomical dissection, but done visually, and I just thought, I have to do something with this. I have to figure things out, and it just slowly led to other images and lots of discourses about how to figure out what our human difference means and what it has meant for centuries.
Mm-hmm. And you went on and got your PhD in
I did. So I was at Northwestern University, and little by little, through research, it was in the history of art with a focus in the history of anatomy in the 16th and 17th century. And so, as one does, you just pursue research, and one question leads to another, and that question leads to something else, and you end up with a thesis because you have very supportive colleagues and mentors who help you write it. And then, I got lucky enough to then have a position that allowed me to not just pursue my research and scholarship, but to actually be able to teach it to students, which really put a different lens into what I was doing, because it forces you to think about its relevance for people who don't know as much on the topic as you do. So it's very refreshing, and it's a really good exercise. Mm-hmm.
So tell me about the book.
So the book is essentially a series of case studies, but I wanted to place them in a way that spoke to not what is odd about them, but what they say about the concept of difference. Mm-hmm. So what makes us think about monsters? What does it mean to be a monster in the 16th or in the 17th century? Mm-hmm. And that is related to what it meant to be a human in the 16th and the 17th century, and how the idea of difference is used by so many people to ostracize a certain group of people so that they can exercise power and control over them. And at first I just thought I was looking at these fascinating images about anatomical difference, but then the more I worked on it, the more I realized that I was talking about a history of difference, and that the sort of the larger themes at the core of it are still very relevant today, because the idea of making someone an other in order to control them is very, very prevalent.
Mm-hmm. So reading the first chapter, I believe it's the first chapter that I was reading, you mentioned sort of, I think Ravenna, as they put it, a monster was born, and then I guess the city suffered some catastrophe,
Yes.
So,
and that's a great summary. Yes, indeed.
So it makes me wonder, apart from the anatomical differences, to treat someone as a monster, does it also require sort of a certain mindset, a feeling of a divine creature putting something like this on the earth?
Yes, so actually a monster, so even the etymology comes from various places, which is, it has the significance if there's divine wrath, right? So God is angry because man has done something that he or she wasn't supposed to do. So God is angry and warning humanity that something will happen if they don't correct their path. So definitely a sign of divine anger. But it can also be an omen in the sense that God may be saying, hey, watch out. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, something may happen, so you still have a chance, but watch out for what might be happening. And so how are these signs read? This is where I think when you're talking about one has to be prepared, one has to be ready to welcome this idea of monstrousness. That is very true. It happens at culturally charged moments where people grab onto what they see as signs in order to justify their actions, or in order to justify other people's actions, to say, well, this wasn't our fault. It just happened to us. There was a divine sign, and it happened to us. So with the monster of Ravenna, there was a whole analysis of, well, this is what it looks like. These are all the emblems that are based on this monster's body, and this is what is going to happen is going to happen. So it really is about series of justifications that find themselves both in theology and in the natural sciences, and they're combined to speak to divine power, but a little bit also to men's parts into that discourse. And I think that, again, in a sense, this is still relevant today, because the idea of justification and faith and divinity intervening is something that we do see happening still today.
So would you say that at that time a monster would have been considered a being that was fundamentally different from humans, apart from, and I'm thinking in terms of skin disease or maybe, cancerous tissue or something, burns and stuff, I guess wouldn't make that person that apart from their fellow human being, whereas is the monster just fundamentally different if identified as a monster?
So this is when it becomes really tricky, because I was hoping that I would find these very definite categories. This is a monster, this is not a monster. And so this is why I was also very careful in the title of my book. I talked about human monsters. The categories are very porous. For example, the dwarves were super popular, and they became almost an emblem of power. So if you were a duke, if you were a king, you wanted to have dwarves surrounding you. And you wanted to have dwarves with a very specific kind of dwarfism, because it was about these proportions that you wanted to have in the bodies of these dwarves. And when you possessed these dwarves, there were objects that were given as gifts. You actually find them in inventories listed as objects, or they were diplomatic gifts that were brought by people to other people. On the other hand, some of these dukes also gave these dwarves lands. They gave them money. They even allowed them to get married, which made them into any regular human being. So they were really oscillating between being a monster and being a human being. And then you talk about visibility, and one of the chapters in my book deals with castrati, so men who were castrated around the age of 7, and then they were trained musically to sing with the ability to sing soprano notes. If you saw them, you wouldn't necessarily know that there was something about their bodies that was considered to be non-normative. However, they fit the categories of being a monster because they didn't fit a sort of binary of gender divisions that was expected of a lot of regular citizens. So this idea of monstrousness is very porous in that it really oscillates, and then there were some monsters that were more popular than others. And then in a lot of treatises we see monsters that are completely created, that were not real. So hybrid marine monsters, for example, that were half whale and, I don't know, half wolf that were in the sea or something. So then these are these completely imaginary creatures. But they all coexist in these cultural moments because they allow human imagination to grow, and they also allow for justification of humans toward themselves, to understand who they are and who they don't want to be.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask how you chose the three different categories. You haven't yet discussed the hirsute. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes, you are, yeah. So the dwarves, the hirsutes, and the castrati, right.
And how did you pick those three categories?
It started with the dwarfs, I must say, just because in the 16th and 17th century they are so prevalent that the more I researched them, the more documents I found. And so spending time in archives and reading a lot of letters and inventories and contracts and even legal trials, they were omnipresent in engravings and paintings and sculptures. So that was sort of an easy walk into looking at human and anatomical difference. And as I was studying them in records, I found that other monsters were listed as well, and those were their hirsutes. So in a sense, they were sort of an accident that happened through the research of the dwarves. And there was one family in particular that appeared over and over again, and it was the Gonsalves family. And I could not study them. Again, because they appeared in the record and they made sense, and they were also the link between several of the larger European families that I was studying. And the discourse about their bodies was also fascinating, is that how do you describe someone who is covered in hair? You want them to remind you of something wild because you want them to fit into a certain category in the 16th century. And yet, this family in particular, the father was educated at the court of France, and he was taught to fight like a knight with a sword. He was taught to read and write in French and Latin, which made him part of a very elite number of people, and he was allowed to marry and have children. So there was this fascinating discourse about what were they, who were they, and then what happens when wars happen and families get destroyed and they have to find a way to live. And then finally the castrati, I have to say, that was my first love, is because there was this amazing portrait of Marcantonio Pasqualini, who is an amazing singer in the 17th century. And there was a dissonance in that painting that I wanted to find out. And the more I read about anatomical dissections and anomalies, the more I learned about hermaphroditic bodies, and the more I understood about the very complex gender divisions or lack thereof in the 15th and 16th century, and how that also worked into making a body a monstrous body. And I thought that fit very well with the other two case studies that I had, because it pointed to a monstrosity that wasn't visible but that was audible. And how do we deal with that? How can we understand that a monstrosity is audible when you're actually painting it or when you're writing about it? So that's how they all sort of came about.
So perhaps this isn't touched on in your book, but I'm curious how the mentality or, say, sanity of these individuals would affect how they were perceived and accepted in court and that sort of thing. You know, did they, if they were insane, were they definitely a monster that had to be locked away and feared, or how did all that work, if you researched that?
No, so that's really interesting, and I actually encountered some of that in my research. The more you research, the more you have to decide what it is that you want to focus on and what you leave to the side. And thankfully what I left on the side is part of my second book project, so at least I can go back to it and reuse it. But the idea of sanity is actually really interesting, because they were jesters at court who were named such and such the crazy one. And they were entertaining, so they were part of the retinue of the duke, of the king, of the prince, and I would say their mental state was, in a sense, used as their entry to court. So what is difficult here is that one cannot really assess whether they truly suffered from a mental illness or whether they adopted that persona in order to find survival at court, because that was a great place for a lot of people to be. I mean, because we're talking about a very, very small segment of the population who is at court and who benefits from the court. So if you could find an entry into a court, you would do what you could to get an entry in there. There is some overlap between some of the dwarves and some of the, as I say, the in French we say les fous, the crazy ones. Some of them do overlap in that some of the dwarves are called crazy ones, and here I'm really using a 16th century nomenclature. But often there are divisions between the jesters and between the dwarves. As far as the other categories that I've looked at, there is a separation as well. Hence the issue, because I think that, for example, for the hirsutes, a lot of writers would have liked them to be wild and to be untamed and to be, in a sense, crazy, but they weren't. They were educated. And so that made it complicated because they were, in a sense, in a liminal position between the categories of humans and savages. I don't know if that answers your questions, but it is. These categories are quite porous, though there's always an attempt to delineate them in the 16th, 17th century.
So apart from the main subject that you're discussing in this book, are there any other issues or themes that we haven't touched on yet?
I mean, I always think that there's so many of them. And I mean, the quote with which I open my book, and it's one that I actually thought about much later. It was way after my book was written that I just decided that would be to open the book, and it's a quote by Salman Rushdie in one of his books, and it says, "This may be the curse of the human race, not that we are so different from one another, but that we are so alike." And to me, this is really at the center of this book and at the center of a lot of the things I study, which is why I make sure to talk about the fact that it's about a history of difference and not necessarily a history of otherness, because otherness means that there is someone at the center that defines what normalcy is. But when we talk about a history of difference, anyone can be different from anyone else. No one defines that normalcy. Difference is a completely relative notion. And I think that's something that I want to push more toward and study more intensely in a way that allows for a lot of circles to overlap and a lot of discussions to occur. And I think that can be transposed to a lot of other discourses, and not just about bodily difference, but about the way in which, the world is conceptualized as well. And in this case, too, I mean, what I have found to be really interesting is how current fiction and science fiction and a lot of creations have looked at these moments, in my case, 16th, 17th century, so we're talking about the Renaissance, but looking at these depictions and looking at these people who were a very strong presence at court and have readopted them and captured that essence and given them a new voice today. So I'm always very interested to see how that happens in creations today, how they're reappropriated and given a new life. And often my friends say, well, don't you get annoyed that it's historically inaccurate? And I don't. I love it. I mean, it's fantastic to give life to something that one finds interesting. My job is to provide the sources and to provide the primary archives that substantiate the history. That's, I provide facts and I provide the theories that accompany those facts. But if that can inspire someone to want to animate those people, there's nothing better. I love it.
Yeah. A lot of fantasy artists today, they look back to, there's a line, sort of a line going back to the Renaissance masters. Their paintings influenced people and so on and so on. Even today, the fantasy artists. So, and obviously, fantasy art involves images of people and things that are different, both fascinating and frightening and that sort of thing. So, I definitely agree with you there. And also Game of Thrones, obviously, you have, that's based on 15th century War of the Roses and stuff, but still applicable.
Sure, there's some 11th century appropriations as well. I love watching this and then having discussions with my husband about, what works and the types of armors that are used and what kinds of relationships are being enacted that are tied to historical narratives, and I just find it amazing. And I think that, in that case, if you look at Tyrion Lannister and the idea that his physical anomaly actually pushes him toward a different kind of discourse about who he is and how he places himself as an advisor, but also the types of access that he has. To me, that is wonderful, and again, a use of historical narrative in a way that allows for imagination to animate that. So.
Well, but speaking with you, it's interesting because, when I think most people who see him in Game of Thrones are think, oh wow, isn't that interesting? A dwarf is having such power, and they think it's just an interesting twist. Whereas talking to you about what you found about dwarves in royal courts, they did have a lot more influence and power in different ways, which I think a lot of people nowadays wouldn't have thought of or suspected.
That's true, and it's really interesting because they seem to be entertaining and harmless, and yet they listen and they're there for the most intense discussions of the ruler of the court with, say, the Pope or with another ruler, and they know what is going on, and they bring that knowledge with them. So they become really trusted advisors. They may not appear as such publicly, and they won't necessarily sign things publicly, but the rulers know, and they rely on them for making those decisions. So it's definitely something that is prevalent, absolutely.
And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the ancient Egyptians, I think, believed dwarves had special accounting powers and would use them as accountants. And I think in Norse culture, I think dwarves were had some special powers and were put in their own separate, villages. I guess that's segregation there, but if I'm not mistaken, those are at least two prominent cultures that sort of venerated, I hate saying dwarves. I feel like that's not a proper term, but that's... So this is, I was going to say, I'm using 16th and 17th century terminology, which I explain in my book is intentional, because it is not meant to be offensive. It respects an etymology and the history of the term in the 16th and 17th century. So in your case, it would work if we're talking about ancient Egypt and classical Rome as well, I must say. So there's a long history of dwarfism and how that is understood in various cultures. And in a sense, there's this notion that they were a perfect miniature representation of a human being, and thus must have had special powers to be that perfected miniature representation. Sorry, I went a little bit off topic.
No, it's very true. There's some tombstones that are actually really affectionately written about dwarves who passed away in classical Rome and in ancient Egypt. So we do know that there was definitely emotional attachments and a different kind of understanding about how they fit into those societies. So you're absolutely right.
So what body of scholars in the 16th century and 17th century primarily studied people with these anatomical differences, and these questions that you bring up?
So it really is varied. I started because I was looking at painters who, by virtue of being employed by courts, were painting courtiers, and dwarfs were part of those courts, as were hirsutes, and as were castrati, because they were sponsored by these rulers. So painters are a fantastic source of knowledge for this because they would apply their own painterly theories to representing these bodies that fell outside of the canon that they were taught in academies. So it's also these moments where they can move outside of what they're taught and apply a little bit of other things to representing these bodies. So I started again with visual artists that moves to engravers as well. There's some sculptors of dwarfs as well. And then in my case, because I look at history of anatomy, there are specific anatomists who are looking at these people and who are interested in studying them as exemplification of pathologies. And this is quite new in the 16th century in particular, to move away from the idea of simple divine omens or the fact that nature does nothing in vain, to really look at these bodies as pathologies and try to understand why they differ in the way that they differ. So without condemnation, but looking at why they differ. Of course, there's some of these anatomists and surgeons who have these parts in their treatises that they write. They look at them as one could call it today objectively, though in the 16th century it's not quite so. But they look at them and they analyze how these bodies look and how they function, and yet the following chapter is about God's wrath and why that happened, and then it's about hybrid monsters that actually don't really fit into those categories. So we have these sort of oscillations back and forth between actual anatomical observations and then going back to theological demonstration. But yeah, usually it is for me it was painters, engravers, anatomists, natural scientists, and some philosophers as well.
So I wanted to ask what resources you use for your research. You've discussed some. Are there more that you'd like? Can you expand on that a little more, on what you use?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, beyond the sort of the primary sources of the actual paintings and the actual engravings, which, you as an art historian too, you worked with very, very closely, I was able to look at a lot of inventories. So it's essentially a list of everything that was possessed by a certain person at a certain time. So I would compare all these inventories from year to year, see what had changed, and I would be able to trace, say, the clothes that were purchased for the dwarfs or for the hirsutes, the garments that were purchased for an operatic performance for a castrato. So I would really follow very closely, because of follow the money, right? It tells you a lot. This led me to account books as well, sort of what are called journals of entries and exits. So what is sold and what is being purchased, and because that tells you a lot. If somebody is spending a lot of money on one of their dwarves, and you see that happening over and over every year, you know that this dwarf was actually quite cherished as part of this family. You don't just spend money on someone for no reason. And then one of the things, too, with these records is that then suddenly one year you see that nothing is spent for that dwarf anymore, and that allows you to figure out that this person has passed. So these are very, very telling. I looked at a lot of letters. I read a lot of letters. That were written from one courtier to another, speaking about their daily routines and what they had done that day and the spectacle that they had attended. And that takes a lot of time because you never know what people are going to say about their day. And so I was really trying to figure out what kind of quotidian place the dwarfs or the hirsutes were having in their life. For the castrati, I also looked at legal accounts, because often it was about whether property could be passed on to castrati, since they weren't able to reproduce and have heirs, how that would function. So trial accounts were something that I looked at as well. And then, because I was looking at artists, contracts for paintings and productions of other works of art were something that were very telling as well.
So where do you find these all these documents?
Well, it's you have to trace them. So in my case, because I'm looking mostly at northern Italian courts and some French courts, I spent a lot of time in Florence. I spent some time in Bologna, Ferrara, and I was in Paris as well, and in the Loire Valley. You essentially just follow the primary documents, and Archivio di Stato and Archives Nationales, so just the National Archives for all of these places. And it can be it can be very frustrating because you don't know what you're going to find. You hope you're going to find it, and you have to keep a record, and you just, sometimes it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, and you end up finding a different needle, and you follow that path. But I mean, it's years and years of research. It seems when you look at the book, you're like, oh, it's kind of small. There it is. But it's years and years of research.
Are these documents photographed or microfiched or anything like that, or do you have to?
I was physically there, and you're actually touching, 16th century letters, and just using, you have to be able to decipher them as well. This was about 10 years ago when I started. I'm trying to think back on the years, but a lot of things are today, they're digitized, which makes life a lot easier for a lot of people. So the Medici Archive project, for example, has a lot of these documents digitized, which allows for easy access but fewer trips to Florence. So I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's a lot of them you're there and you're looking, and sometimes you have a wax papal seal that just falls, on your computer as you open your huge batch of documents, and those are really happy moments. But a lot of them I was lucky enough to be able to go physically in the archive and stay there for a few months and do research and, physically be there, touch the documents and do the work.
What part of the research was most enjoyable?
Aside from being in some of the most beautiful places in the world, I would say just knowing that you are following these stories that eventually make history. And my goal was really to illustrate the voices of these people that weren't necessarily amplified at first. So they often have fallen on the margins of history, and I think that they're quite central to history. It is through difference that we define ourselves, and that was a big motivator for me, was to tell myself, okay, just keep on going, even if you don't find something today or tomorrow or this next month, keep on going. I'm sure that, this Morgante, who's, my favorite dwarf here, but Morgante's voice is going to come out somehow. Just try and find it. And the most enjoyable moments were when I did find those voices in the documents that I was looking for. And just knowing no one else had looked at some of these was amazing. And I just felt that I was being useful, and I was hopefully helping bring to light some of the stories that history had left aside.
Yeah, I just imagine the castrati. He's still singing to this day through your work.
That's lovely. Thank you.
It's just a thought that popped in. Yeah.
That's lovely.
So, what did you find that was most surprising in your research?
I think because I was taught to be so objective and so rational, and this is history, and we are leaving all emotions aside, I was not expecting to be so emotionally involved and to see so many emotions in the documents that I was studying. There's a genuine affection that becomes more and more transparent as one reads those documents. So, for instance, for Marcantonio Pasqualini, the castrato, his patron genuinely, I believe, cared for him. He wanted to help him. He wanted him in his household. Or for the hirsute family, I believe that Catherine de Medici Valois really cared for them. They're staying in the French court until the year she dies. And only when she dies do they have to leave, and that is years and years after her husband dies, who was the original protector of that family. So through the documents, you really see her attempting over and over again to protect them, to make sure that they don't have to spread through Europe and essentially become show monsters. But she wants them to remain at the court of France under her protection. And that is never stated per se, but it is, again, those inventories, those expenses, those are very telling. And I was surprised. I was not expecting to see emotional connections transpire through those documents.
Was there a question or issue that was particularly difficult to research that just took a while to get an answer to, or maybe you're still grappling with?
I mean, I would say most of them I didn't understand. Everything takes so long that there are moments where you've been looking at incomprehensible writing for months and you just want something to come out. So those moments were tough. But as far as answers, I think I wanted to, when I first started, I really wanted to have an answer. Are these people considered objects or subjects in the 16th and 17th century? I wanted a black and white answer. And I really started with that idea. I didn't know what I was going to prove, but I knew I was going to prove it was one or the other based on the documents that I would find. And increasingly, and I think I've only reconciled this with my own self, they're neither, and they're both at the same time. And I think that seemed to be perfectly fine with 16th and 17th century audiences. And that was a big lesson for me too, because the idea today that we seem to be opening our eyes to the notion of non-binary genders, to the idea of welcoming a variety of differences. A lot of people say, oh, that is so modern, and it's not. It is something that was present in the 16th and 17th century. Things were a lot more fluid than I think we tend to believe. And so I wanted to have a yes or no answer, and I didn't, and I'm really glad that I didn't.
So you already mentioned something that was emotional for you in this research. Do you have any other examples of things that either positively or negatively moved you as you did your research?
Quite a bit, I have to say. For example, with the Hirsute family, the younger girl, Antonieta Gonzalez, she sort of disappears after a while. We assume she gets married, and she disappears. And even though I really wanted to not apply my own fictional narrative to her, I hope that she disappears because she marries someone and has children, and her children are in hirsutes, so they're of no interest to a lot of natural scientists, and she's left alone, and that's a good thing. It's being able to be left alone and have the life that she was taught to have, because she is taught to read and write as well. And in a sense, her absence was emotional, but it made me want to believe that it was not because she died early in age, but just because she became non-interesting for people, and that was a good thing. Not being interesting would have been a good thing. There were also for me, one of the things, and I knew from the beginning that I couldn't deal with this, was cruelty toward animals, and you read that quite a bit in a lot of these anatomical documents, there's a lot of vivisection that is done, and I have to say, even though everything about the work that I do is objective, and I understand that it is a lens toward the 16th and the 17th century, and we do not apply our own judgments to the 16th and the 17th century, it was very difficult for me to read about the ways in which animals were used. So those were moments that I knew I simply just could not push through, that I would have to sort of set that research aside, take a breath, and try to recalibrate with sort of ideas to do something different. So those were a little tough moments that I didn't want to really have, but yeah.
So what do you hope the book will do ultimately?
Well, that's a big question. I think that I'm so pleased to be able to speak about this with you. So already the book has done what it should be doing, which is to spark conversations about humans and about human difference and about how we can find out about human difference. And the fact that difference shouldn't be used as a tool to create divisiveness, but as a tool to understand our own selves and each other better. And hopefully it also provides scholars with sources that I hope can be helpful in understanding more about the history of that difference and the history of the case studies that I have. But I think ultimately I'm just pleased to talk about a historical precedent for how we can today think about human difference and inclusivity and the ability to speak about it, to not ignore it, because that's also not a solution, to sort of pretend that everyone is the same and everything is perfect. It's not, that we need to be able to speak about it in informed ways. So if the book can help with that, I would be delighted.
Okay, good. Can you speak to any difficulties you had in finishing or getting the book published and how you overcame those?
Sure. Yeah, well, in academia, you're always overworked. I mean, that's just what happens. So in my case, I was very lucky that as I wasn't even done with the dissertation and I got a tenure track job, but that also means that you're teaching and you're doing, you're on various committees in your new university and you're basically doing work all the time. So balancing research and work is quite tough. And then I became chair, and then, it was just a lot to do. So it was really just time management. I made a choice to work, and I was very lucky because I have a mentor who is amazing, who's at Wellesley, and who always told me to consider quality of life in whatever choice I made. Mm-hmm. And she said that will allow you to make the right decisions because they're the right decisions for you. And so I made a choice to work with a senior acquisitions editor who was so kind and so patient that getting the book published was actually not an issue because she guided me in what I needed to do. Mm-hmm. So it was just a matter of finding time and then eventually just gathering things and pushing it forward. The research, of course, is hugely time consuming and that takes years, but eventually the publication is just a matter of finding the time, focusing your mind on doing it, and in my case, being lucky to work with someone like Erica Gaffney, who was, again, patient and smart and kind and generous and very, very helpful. So that's what I would recommend to everyone. Find someone who will be kind to you and who will help you as you do all the work.
So you touched on your next writing project. Can you elaborate a little more on what you plan to write?
Sure. So once I find the time, because right now being associate provost is taking a little bit of my time, as I was saying, I think that there are these things that one finds when one does research and you just don't have time to include all of them, and I set some of them aside. And it continues on the idea of a monstrosity, but it presents them in a more theoretical fashion. And so I'm moving toward French courts. And I'm starting with a portrait of François Ier as a hermaphrodite and looking at alchemy and what that means for this portrait. I believe that he's actually not an androgynous being, but rather a superhuman being, meaning he has both genders in one place so that he can generate the state. And so I look at the evolution of what that means for France until we get to his grandson, Henri III, who is also represented as a hermaphrodite in pamphlets that are strongly against his rulership and say that essentially because he's a hermaphrodite, which he is not, but because he's a hermaphrodite, he's unable to rule in a stable fashion over France. So what I'm looking at is this idea of gender monstrosity and how it is at first created in order to assert rulership, but then how it is being used by the people of France against the family of rulers who essentially invented it. So how that turns against them.
So where can people find the book, and also do you have any social media or website where people can follow your thoughts and work as it progresses?
Oh, well, social media site, not really. My faculty profile would be where you could find all this information. So if you just Google my name, that's something that comes up I think it's probably the first or second thing that comes up. And the book you can find on quite a few sites. I think it's on Amazon right now as well. So that would be an easy place to find.
So that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, just very thankful for the discussion. And, really happy to have talked with you.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. One of the best ways in which you can provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you like this, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't, and I'll use that feedback to hopefully make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on Facebook under Chris Alvarez WLC, on YouTube under Chris Alvarez WLC, and on Twitter under Chris Alvarez WLC. You can also get more information on my website, chrisalvarez.com. Please remember my name Chris does not have an H, so it's ChrisAlvarez.com. Thanks for listening, and keep imagining the future.